Margaret Henderson had worked for the Whitmore family for 37 years, and today would be her last day in their grand Victorian mansion overlooking the Hudson Valley. She had arrived at the estate in 1987 as a young woman of 25, desperate for work after her husband's unexpected death in a construction accident. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the library where she had spent countless hours organizing Mr. Charles Whitmore's business documents, dusting the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and maintaining the antique oak desk that had belonged to 3 generations of Whitmores. Never could she have imagined that this room, where she had worked in quiet solitude for decades, would become the setting for the most shocking revelation of her life. The mansion itself was a testament to old American wealth, built in 1892 by Charles Sr.'s grandfather with money earned from railroad investments. Its 43 rooms housed priceless artwork, Persian rugs worth more than most people's annual salaries, and furniture that had been carefully preserved for over a century. Margaret knew every inch of this house intimately. She had scrubbed every floor, polished every banister, and cleaned every window countless times over the decades. The estate lawyer, Mr. Davidson, cleared his throat as the family gathered around the enormous mahogany table that dominated the center of the library. Charles Whitmore, Jr., the deceased patriarch's eldest son and Margaret's current employer for the past 15 years, sat at the head with his usual air of superiority, his expensive Italian suit perfectly pressed and his gold watch glinting in the afternoon light. At 48, he had inherited his father's sharp business mind but none of his compassion for those he considered beneath his social status. His wife Patricia clutched her designer Hermes handbag, her perfectly manicured nails drumming nervously against the leather as she contemplated the windfall that awaited them. She had married into the Whitmore family 22 years ago, initially charmed by Charles Sr.'s old-world courtesy, but had quickly learned that the family fortune came with expectations of proper behavior that she had never quite mastered. Her relationship with Margaret had always been strained, marked by passive-aggressive comments about household management and thinly veiled resentment toward someone she viewed as having too much influence with the family patriarch. Their 2 adult children, Michael and Sarah, scrolled through their phones with obvious boredom, both in their late 20s and accustomed to the family's wealth but having never worked a day in their privileged lives. Michael, at 29, had graduated from Harvard with a business degree that he had never used, preferring to live off his trust fund while pursuing various hobbies that never lasted more than a few months. Sarah, 27, had a degree in art history from Vassar, but spent most of her time shopping and attending charity galas where she could see and be seen by New York's social elite. The September afternoon carried a crisp autumn chill that seemed to match the cold atmosphere in the room. Outside, the Hudson River reflected the changing colors of the maple and oak trees that surrounded the property, their leaves beginning their annual transformation from green to gold and crimson. The estate's manicured grounds stretched for nearly 10 acres, including formal gardens that Margaret had helped maintain, a tennis court that rarely saw use, and a carriage house that had been converted into a guest residence. Please subscribe to our channel to help us bring you more real stories like this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us as we continue sharing these incredible tales of justice and unexpected turns. Margaret stood quietly by the doorway in her navy blue uniform, the same style she had worn for over 3 decades, her graying hair pulled back in the neat bun that had become her signature look. She had been asked to remain for what Charles Jr. dismissively called administrative details, assuming she would need to be informed about changes to her employment or perhaps receive a modest severance package. At 62, she had devoted more than half her life to this family, arriving each morning at 6:30 and often not leaving until after 9 in the evening. She had raised this family in ways their own parents never had, teaching Michael to tie his shoes when he was 5 because his nanny was too busy, staying up all night with Sarah when she had pneumonia at age 7 because Patricia was attending a charity event in the city, cooking special meals when the children were homesick during their boarding school breaks. She had been more of a mother to Michael and Sarah than their own parents ever were, yet she knew her place in the family hierarchy, or so she thought. The invisible boundaries of class and employment had been reinforced daily through countless small interactions that reminded her she was valued for her service, not her person. Her own life had been shaped around the needs of the Whitmore family. She had never remarried after her husband's death, dedicating herself entirely to her work and to raising her son David as a single mother. David was now 34, a successful pediatric surgeon in Manhattan, married to a wonderful woman named Karen who worked as a social worker. Margaret's greatest pride was that despite their modest circumstances, she had managed to put David through college and medical school, working extra hours and saving every penny to ensure he would have opportunities she never had. The reading began with the usual legal formalities, Mr. Davidson's voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room as he explained the procedures and legal requirements for executing such a substantial estate. Charles Sr. had been worth approximately $12 million, accumulated through decades of successful real estate investments and his construction company, Whitmore and Associates, which he had built from a small operation with 3 employees into one of the Hudson Valley's most respected construction firms. The family leaned forward eagerly as Mr. Davidson outlined the primary bequests with methodical precision. The mansion, valued at $2.8 million, would go to Charles Jr., along with all its contents except for specific items mentioned elsewhere in the will. The business, worth roughly $4 million according to the most recent valuation, would be split between the grandchildren when they turned 30, though they would begin receiving dividends immediately. Various stocks and bonds, collected over decades of careful investment, were divided among family members, each inheritance substantial enough to secure comfortable futures for generations to come. There were also smaller bequests to longtime employees. The gardener would receive $20,000, the part-time chef would get $15,000, and the cleaning service that assisted Margaret would receive a generous bonus. Charles Sr. had always believed in rewarding loyalty, a trait that had irritated his son, who viewed such gestures as unnecessary expenditures that reduced the family's wealth. Charles Jr. smirked with satisfaction, already calculating his newfound wealth and making mental plans for renovations to the mansion and perhaps the purchase of a vacation home in the Hamptons. He had never appreciated his father's tendency to treat the staff with respect and unusual generosity, often complaining that the old man was too soft when it came to business relationships with employees. She was just staff, he had muttered to his wife on more than one occasion when discussing Margaret's long tenure with the family, particularly when his father had insisted on giving her paid time off when her mother was dying of cancer. Charles Jr. had different plans for running the household. He intended to modernize the staff arrangements, perhaps hiring a service company rather than maintaining individual employees who had become too comfortable and, in his opinion, too expensive. He had already discussed with Patricia the possibility of selling some of the artwork to fund their lifestyle changes, viewing his father's collection as assets to be liquidated rather than treasures to be preserved. Patricia, meanwhile, was mentally redecorating the mansion, planning to remove what she called all that old-fashioned furniture and replace it with contemporary pieces that would better reflect her own taste. She had always felt overshadowed by the memory of Eleanor, Charles Sr.'s beloved wife, who had died 8 years earlier after a long battle with breast cancer. Eleanor had been universally loved by everyone who met her, including Margaret, who had cared for her during her final months with a devotion that had moved even the coldest hearts. But Mr. Davidson wasn't finished. He flipped to the final page of the will, a document that had been carefully revised and notarized just 6 months before Charles Sr.'s passing from a sudden heart attack. The lawyer's expression grew more serious as he prepared to read the section that would change everything the family thought they knew about their patriarch's final wishes. "There is one final bequest," he announced, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room pause their private celebrations and mental spending plans. The afternoon light had begun to fade, casting longer shadows across the Persian rugs and creating an almost theatrical atmosphere in the book-lined room. Margaret felt her heart racing as an unexplained sense of anticipation washed over her. She had been present during many family meetings over the years, watching from the sidelines as decisions were made that affected her daily life but never her future. She remembered Charles Sr.'s kindness during her mother's prolonged illness, how he had not only given her time off but had quietly arranged for the best oncologists in the region to consult on her mother's case, paying for treatments that would have been financially impossible otherwise. She remembered his gentle encouragement when she had worried about David's college tuition costs, and his quiet pride when that same son had graduated summa cum laude from medical school. Charles Sr. had attended David's graduation ceremony, sitting in the family section as if he were truly Margaret's father, beaming with pride as her son received his diploma. That day, he had told her that David's success was a reflection of her character and dedication as a mother. The lawyer's voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. To Margaret Elizabeth Henderson, who has been not just an employee but a true member of this family for 37 years, who raised my grandchildren with more love and dedication than they often received elsewhere, who cared for my late wife Eleanor during her final illness with the tenderness of a daughter, and who has maintained our home with pride and dignity through decades of faithful service, treating every task as if it were a sacred duty. The words seemed to hang in the air as Charles Jr.'s face began to change color, shifting from confident satisfaction to confused concern, then to something approaching panic. His hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and a thin line of perspiration appeared on his forehead despite the cool autumn air flowing through the partially open windows. Margaret's hands trembled as she gripped the doorframe, her legs suddenly feeling weak beneath her. She had expected perhaps a small token of appreciation, maybe a few $1,000s or a piece of jewelry that had belonged to Eleanor. But the formal language and solemn tone suggested something far more significant than she had ever dared to imagine. The family members exchanged confused glances, Patricia's mouth falling open slightly as she began to comprehend that their financial windfall might not be as substantial as they had assumed. Michael and Sarah had finally put down their phones, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold in their previously predictable world of inherited privilege. I leave the sum of $3 million to be transferred immediately upon my death, along with the deed to the cottage property on Maple Street, which she has admired during our many walks through the neighborhood. Additionally, I establish a trust fund in the amount of $500,000 for her son David's continued medical education and future grandchildren's educational needs. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles Jr. shot to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "This is impossible," he stammered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "She was just staff. My father couldn't have been in his right mind." Mr. Davidson adjusted his glasses and continued reading. "I make this bequest with full knowledge that some family members may question my decision. Margaret Henderson has shown me more loyalty, kindness, and genuine affection in her years of service than I have received from those who share my blood but not my values. She has earned every penny through decades of selfless dedication." Patricia gasped audibly, dropping her handbag to the floor with a loud thud. Michael and Sarah finally looked up from their phones, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and anger. The family that had just minutes before been celebrating their inheritance now found themselves confronting the reality that their hired help had just become wealthier than any of them individually. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of joy alone. They were tears of validation, of recognition, of a lifetime of quiet service finally being acknowledged. She thought of all the times she had worked late into the evening, preparing for the family's dinner parties. She remembered staying overnight when the children were sick, rocking them to sleep when their parents were too busy with social obligations. Charles Jr. turned to face her, his expression twisted with rage and disbelief. "You manipulated him," he accused, pointing a shaking finger in her direction. "A dying old man, and you took advantage of his confusion." But Margaret had found her voice, strengthened by years of quiet dignity, and the sudden realization that she no longer needed to remain silent. "Your father wasn't confused, Charles," she said, using his first name for the first time in decades. "He was grateful. He saw what you refused to see for 37 years. The lawyer intervened before the situation could escalate further. "Mr. Whitmore, I must inform you that your father was of completely sound mind when this will was drafted. I have medical documentation and witness statements to support the validity of every provision. Mrs. Henderson's bequest is legally binding and will be executed immediately." Margaret walked slowly into the room, no longer the invisible presence in the background, but a woman who had just inherited more money than she had ever dreamed possible. She looked at each family member, seeing clearly for the first time the entitled expressions and cold hearts that Charles Sr. had grown tired of enabling. "I want you all to know," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite her emotions, "that your father spoke of you often, He hoped until the end that you would develop the compassion and gratitude that seemed to come so naturally to your mother. Eleanor used to tell me that kindness was the only inheritance that truly mattered. Sarah, who had barely acknowledged Margaret's existence throughout her 28 years, suddenly spoke up. "Grandmother always said you were special," she admitted reluctantly. "She used to tell us we should learn from your example." The weight of decades seemed to settle over the room. Margaret remembered Eleanor's final months, how she had held the woman's hand during chemotherapy sessions, while her own family remained conspicuously absent. She had been the one to help Eleanor write letters to her grandchildren, hoping to bridge the growing emotional distance that wealth and privilege had created. Charles Jr. slumped back into his chair, the reality of his father's judgment settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had inherited the house and a substantial sum, but he had also inherited the knowledge that his father found him lacking in basic human decency. The man who had built the family fortune from nothing had seen more worth in his housekeeper than in his own son. Margaret walked to the window, looking out at the gardens she had helped maintain for so many years. The maple trees were beginning to turn their autumn colors, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. She thought of the small cottage on Maple Street that was now hers, a place where she could finally rest after decades of service. Mr. Davidson began explaining the practical details of the inheritance transfer. Margaret would need to meet with financial advisors, set up bank accounts, and make decisions about investments. The cottage deed would be transferred within the week, and the trust fund for her son would be established immediately. As the family began to file out of the library, their earlier excitement replaced by sullen acceptance of their reduced expectations, Patricia approached Margaret hesitantly. "I want you to know," she said quietly, "that Charles Sr. was right about you. I was always too proud to admit it, but you were the heart of this household." Margaret nodded gracefully, accepting the belated recognition without bitterness. She had learned long ago that holding grudges only poisoned the holder, not the target. Michael, who had always been the more sensitive of the two grandchildren, stopped before leaving the room. "Margaret," he said, using her name with new respect, "I'm sorry we never properly thanked you for everything you did for us. Grandfather was right to honor your service this way." As the last family member left the library, Margaret found herself alone with Mr. Davidson. The lawyer smiled warmly and began gathering his documents. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, "Charles Sr. specifically asked me to give you this letter after the reading." Margaret's hands shook as she opened the envelope, recognizing Charles Sr.'s careful handwriting immediately. The letter read, "My dear Margaret, if you are reading this, then my family has learned what I have known for decades, that true worth is not measured by blood relations or social status, but by the content of one's character. You have been the daughter I wished I had and the grandmother my grandchildren deserved. Your inheritance is not charity but payment long overdue for services that could never be adequately compensated. Use this gift to build the life you have always deserved but were too selfless to pursue. With deepest gratitude and affection, Charles." Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it in her apron pocket, the same apron she had worn for thousands of days in service to this family. Tomorrow she would hang it up for the last time and begin a new chapter of her life, one where her value was not only recognized but celebrated. The autumn sun was setting as she walked through the mansion one final time, remembering the laughter of children, the quiet conversations with Eleanor, and the countless small moments that had made her service feel like love rather than work. She had given 37 years of her life to this family, and in return, Charles Sr. had given her the freedom to write her own ending. 3 months later, Margaret stood in her own kitchen in the cottage on Maple Street, preparing dinner for her son David and her daughter-in-law Karen, who were visiting from the city. The house was smaller than the Whitmore mansion but filled with warmth and laughter that had been missing from those grand rooms for too many years. David looked around the cozy cottage with obvious pleasure. "I still can't believe Mr. Whitmore did that for you, Mom," he said, shaking his head in amazement. $3.5 million. You could travel the world, buy anything you want." Margaret smiled as she seasoned the roast chicken, using the same recipe she had perfected over decades of cooking for others. Money is nice, son, but what your Mr. Charles really gave me was something more valuable, recognition. For 37 years, I wondered if my work mattered, if I was making a difference in anyone's life. That reading answered every question I ever had about my worth. She had established a scholarship fund at the local community college for working mothers seeking education, donated to the hospital where Eleanor had been treated, and invested the remainder of her inheritance wisely. The cottage was paid for, her son's education secured, and her future grandchildren's college funds established. Karen, who had only recently joined the family, listened with fascination to the stories Margaret shared about her years with the Whitmores. "What happened to Charles Jr. and his family?" she asked. Margaret's expression remained neutral, free from bitterness or satisfaction. "They're managing," she said simply. "Charles Jr. had to sell some of his inheritance to pay estate taxes, and the children are learning to work for their living. Patricia got a job at an art gallery downtown. It's probably the best thing that could have happened to them." The truth was more complex than Margaret let on. Charles Jr. had initially attempted to contest the will, hiring expensive lawyers to challenge his father's mental capacity. But the documentation was thorough, and the case had been dismissed quickly. The legal fees had consumed a significant portion of his inheritance, and the public nature of the dispute had damaged his social standing in their wealthy community. Michael had surprised everyone by using his inheritance to start a non-profit organization focused on supporting domestic workers' rights and fair wages. He had reached out to Margaret several times, asking for her input and guidance. Sarah had moved to California and was reportedly working as a teacher, having discovered a previously unknown talent for working with children. As Margaret cleaned up after dinner, she reflected on the unexpected turns life had taken. She had spent most of her adult years believing that her value lay in her ability to serve others, to anticipate their needs and fulfill them quietly and efficiently. Charles Sr.'s final gift had been the revelation that her worth was intrinsic, not dependent on her usefulness to others. The cottage phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Michael calling from the nonprofit office where he now spent most of his time. "Margaret, I wanted to update you on the foundation's progress," he said, his voice carrying an enthusiasm she had never heard during his privileged childhood. "We've helped establish fair wage standards for domestic workers in 3 counties, and we're expanding to include healthcare benefits and retirement planning." Margaret smiled, recognizing the echoes of his grandfather's compassion in his voice. "Your grandfather would be proud, Michael," she said warmly. "He always believed that those who have much should help those who have little." After hanging up the phone, Margaret walked onto her small front porch, looking out at the street where she had walked so many times with Charles Sr. during his evening constitutionals. He had often stopped to chat with neighbors, remembering their children's names and asking about their lives with genuine interest. Those walks had been some of their most meaningful conversations, when he had shared his disappointments with his family and his hope that his grandchildren might develop greater empathy as they matured. A young woman walking by recognized her and waved. It was Jennifer, a single mother who lived 3 houses down and had recently started classes at the community college thanks to Margaret's scholarship fund. "Mrs. Henderson," she called out, "I wanted to thank you again. I got an A on my accounting midterm." Margaret waved back, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from helping others achieve their dreams. This was what Charles Sr. had understood, that true wealth lay not in accumulating money but in using resources to lift others up. As winter deepened and spring approached, Margaret began to understand the full impact of Charles Sr.'s final gift. The money had been life-changing, certainly, but the psychological transformation had been even more profound. For the first time in her adult life, she could make choices based on her own desires rather than the needs of others. She had indeed taken that Mediterranean cruise, spending 3 weeks visiting Italy, Greece, and Turkey with a small group of other travelers her age. The experience had been revelatory. She discovered that she loved ancient history and had a natural gift for languages, picking up basic Italian and Greek phrases with surprising ease. She had stood in the Colosseum in Rome, walked through the ruins of Pompeii, and watched the sunset over the Aegean Sea from the deck of her ship, marveling at how different the world looked when viewed through the eyes of someone who was finally free. Upon returning home, She had enrolled in community college classes in art history and literature, subjects she had always been curious about but never had time to explore. Her professors were impressed by her insights and mature perspective, and she had made friends with classmates ranging from 18 to 75 years old. For the first time in decades, she was learning for the pure joy of learning, not to better serve others but to enrich her own mind and spirit. The cottage on Maple Street had been transformed into a warm and welcoming home that reflected her own tastes rather than those of her employers. She had furnished it with comfortable, well-made pieces that were elegant but not ostentatious, choosing warm colors and soft textures that created an atmosphere of peace and contentment. The small garden in the backyard had become her special project, where she grew vegetables and flowers with the same care she had once devoted to the Whitmore estate's formal gardens, but now for her own pleasure rather than duty. David visited regularly, often bringing Karen and their 2 young children, Margaret's beloved grandchildren, who knew her as a doting grandmother rather than a hard-working employee who rarely had time for personal relationships. 7-year-old Emma and 5-year-old James loved spending weekends at their grandmother's cottage, where she read them stories, taught them to bake cookies, and played games in the garden without constantly glancing at the clock or worrying about other responsibilities. The scholarship fund she had established had grown beyond her initial expectations, now supporting 15 students annually in their pursuit of higher education. She had named it the Eleanor Whitmore Memorial Scholarship, honoring the woman who had treated her with more kindness and respect than her own family members. The recipients were all working mothers like she had once been, women who were struggling to balance employment with education while raising children on limited incomes. Margaret had also become involved with a non-profit organization that advocated for domestic workers' rights, using her newfound financial independence to support legislation that would guarantee fair wages, healthcare benefits, and retirement security for people who had traditionally been invisible to policymakers. She spoke at conferences and legislative hearings, sharing her story not for personal recognition, but to illustrate the broader issues facing millions of workers in similar positions. The irony of her transformation wasn't lost on her. The woman who had spent decades making other people comfortable was finally learning to prioritize her own comfort and happiness. She had discovered that she enjoyed traveling, loved learning, and had a talent for advocating for social justice causes. These aspects of her personality had been dormant for so long that she had almost forgotten they existed. Sometimes former colleagues from the domestic worker community would visit, marveling at her good fortune but also drawing inspiration from her example. Margaret was always careful to emphasize that her situation was unusual, that she had been extraordinarily lucky to work for someone who recognized and valued her contributions. But she also used these conversations to encourage others to value themselves more highly, to demand fair treatment, and to remember that their dignity was not dependent on their employer's approval. The Whitmore family's story had continued to unfold in ways that surprised everyone involved. Charles Jr. had eventually been forced to sell several valuable pieces from his father's art collection to pay for his failed legal challenge to the will and to cover some poor investment decisions he had made with his inheritance. The public nature of his dispute with Margaret had damaged his reputation in social circles where he had once moved comfortably, and several of his father's former business associates had quietly distanced themselves from him. Patricia had indeed gotten that job at the art gallery, initially out of financial necessity but eventually discovering that she had a genuine passion for contemporary sculpture. The work had given her a sense of purpose that had been missing during her years as a wealthy housewife, and she had slowly begun to develop her own identity separate from her husband's social standing. In a surprising turn of events, she had reached out to Margaret several times, eventually offering what could only be described as an apology for years of dismissive treatment. Michael's nonprofit work had flourished beyond anyone's expectations, including his own. The foundation now operated in 12 states, providing legal assistance to domestic workers facing wage theft, unsafe working conditions, and employment discrimination. He had discovered a passion for social justice that had been completely absent during his privileged youth, and his transformation had been so complete that he often spoke publicly about the lessons he had learned from his grandfather's housekeeper. Sarah had surprised everyone by embracing her new life as a public school teacher in Oakland, California. Working with underprivileged children had awakened a compassion and sense of purpose that her wealthy upbringing had never required her to develop. She had earned a teaching credential, taken a position at a school where most students qualified for free lunch, and had discovered that she had a natural gift for connecting with young people who faced challenges she had never experienced. Both grandchildren had maintained regular contact with Margaret, seeking her advice and sharing their experiences as they navigated their dramatically changed circumstances. They had come to understand that their grandfather's will had been not just a redistribution of wealth but a masterclass in recognizing true value and character. As Margaret's second year of freedom drew to a close, she reflected on the profound lessons embedded in her unexpected inheritance. She had learned that self-worth didn't require external validation, that it was never too late to pursue dreams, and that the most meaningful forms of wealth couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Charles Sr.'s final gift had been the revelation that she deserved to be valued not just for what she could do for others, but for who she was as a human being. The cottage on Maple Street had become more than just a home. It was a symbol of possibility, proof that lives could be transformed and that dignity could be restored even after decades of being overlooked. Margaret Henderson, who had spent 37 years being just staff to everyone except the one person whose opinion ultimately mattered most, had finally stepped into a life where her true worth was not only recognized but celebrated.